Actually, to make it easier, I'll do the intro after. So, Aura, how are you getting on? All is good. All is good. We had a bit of a conversation with the Law Society during the week, and I remember on the call just before it, as we were going through it, we were talking through everything, and it just popped into my mind. I said, this is somebody I have to get on the podcast because of, first off, we had a really, let's say, a call with the institution or the establishment, and on the call you were able to get points across, but at the same time a couple of curse words thrown in here and there, and I thought that was the perfect person. That's exactly who I want to go into this debate with, someone who isn't going to align to anything too serious and is up for having a bit of crack at the same time. So let's talk a little bit around about your background. So you're a holistic psychologist and a psychotherapist, a trauma specialist. Tell me, what's the difference between holistic psychology and psychotherapy?
Okay, so I think maybe we first start by thinking about what's the difference between psychology and psychotherapy. And the answer is it's complicated. There's overlap, right? So if we think about psychotherapy, that's kind of the provision of like long-term, deep therapeutic work. And it can be of a myriad of like different styles or approaches to it. Psychology is more of like a formalized academic discipline. Psychologists aren't necessarily practitioners. For example, you can have academic psychologists who do research and who never get into a practice room and do the therapy side of things. So I think one of the reasons why I often will mention the psychotherapy alongside the psychology is to just kind of emphasize that my speciality and my focus has been, I don't know the tense of that sentence, but is on the provision of long-term therapeutic support. The holistic part of the psychology bit is more of a recognition of a certain way of doing things. So holistic psychology, in most definitions, is a branch of psychology that takes mind, body, and whatever is we're calling sort of spirit, self, that kind of thing. I don't necessarily mean it in a religious sense. So I think of it more as self, so mind, body, and self, rather than just mind, just thoughts, just cognitions, which often psychology can get kind of very wrapped up in either behavior or cognition and sort of things like the body, and sort of deeper, it doesn't always enter the picture necessarily, though often does. So yeah, it's just kind of a recognition of my angle that I take on things.
Yeah, okay. It's an interesting one. I think the holistic side of things is obviously something that's to the fore at the moment as well. You can see people are starting to connect the mind body a bit more. While before it was nearly, I don't know, would you say, kind of pigeonholed into, like, for me especially as a physio, it was okay, you're physio, you need to look at the biomechanical. You need to look at somebody has an injury, it's the pain that they have is related to that injury. But oftentimes when you're looking at the chronic side of things, the injury itself heals, but the body holds onto it a bit more. And you could say that's from the physical trauma of the injury or because of what's going on in their environment at the time. Is that something that you may have run into in the past yourself?
Yeah, I mean, in that sort of long-term chronic injured place, both physically and mentally, is something that many of my clients have experienced, and it's something I've experienced myself personally. So yeah, that when you're getting into the realms of like chronic pain or the more psychosomatic kind of experiences that can come with being injured for a long period of time, then I mean, as we've kind of spoken about this already, I think in our previous conversation, but obviously this is a new podcast. Um, it's like it's insufficient, I think, to just focus on the biomechanical aspect, because at this point there's a psychological aspect to the picture. There's it becomes more complicated, so we need a more holistic approach if we're actually going to resolve anything. It can't be pigeonholed as just mind or just body.
Yeah, it can't be. The thing is, they still do it. Like, I still have conversations with physios all the time, and they're coming to me and said, like, I don't know why this lady has come to me with a back issue. We've done everything. We've tried the bird dogs, we've tried the cat cows, we've tried everything, but it keeps coming back. And so it must be something deeper. It must be that she needs surgery or something. And then I'd often say to them, well, have you talked to them about what's going on in their life at the moment? Have you looked at the issues that they may be dealing with, what their environment is like, what their family relationship is like? I think that that side of things is, it's overlooked in physiotherapy. And I think that sometimes we feel that, well, that's not our job. That's a psychologist's job. And it is. There's no question, our psychotherapist's job. It is. But how do you find the like, where's the boundary, or is there crossover? What do you have to do to help these people? Because the goal is to facilitate their healing.
Yeah, it can be so difficult, because when you are dealing with something that is psychosomatic, and I think long-term injury, we can kind of classify that as psychosomatic in a lot of ways. It's the two now. It's like, where is that boundary? Where does what the physio is doing have to sort of release into what the psych is doing, and vice versa? We both have to kind of acknowledge the limits of our own professions. But I think, much like in how mainstream psychology, most psychologists may not be kind of informed about the biomechanics and how the body works and how the body may sustain something like this. I was involved in a piece of research a little while ago that looked at physiotherapists and how much psychology they'd been exposed to, and the answer was not a huge amount. And
Put lightly.
just to summarize that bit of research, and that gets especially difficult when you're working in spaces like you are, where at a certain point you are going to have a conversation with the person who owns the body, and think about, well, what else is going on in life. But yeah, then there's that boundary of, when does it stop being physio and start being something else?
Yeah, the crossover there is, I think in years to come there might be more of a, and probably at the moment there is that kind of integration between the two of them. But I also think that one of the big issues that we're going to run into in years to come is that, well, now we could go deep here for a second, but I really think that a lot can be learned from the pain that people have. I think that the avoidance of pain sometimes can become a bigger issue. And I would love to know what your knowledge or your perspective is on the idea of holding that pain inside. What's the research saying on conditions outside of, let's say, because back pain, 95% of back pain, non-specific back pain, has no physical cause. I know in other cases, when you look at more severe issues, do you ever find that people are holding like repressed emotions, and that at times that can come out as a disease or an illness? I know we can look at certain issues in physio, and you could clearly point and say that there's a somatic basis to that.
I mean, I think a field of research that I'm finding particularly interesting at the moment, and I probably haven't gotten into it quite deeply enough to be able to speak about it with complete authority, but it's worth mentioning anyway, is kind of the field of psychoneuroimmunology. And this field that is kind of, it's the overlap of the psychology, the neuroscience, and immunology, and how diseases, certain diseases, particularly things like autoimmune diseases, can have an emotional component. This particular field is really interesting to me at the moment, because it's kind of one of the few places where we're doing mind and body stuff at the same time. And we're looking at how all of that interacts. And I mean, things like chronic pain and lower back pain and all of this, the work that I've done in any case, kind of, we can look at things like, it comes back to the nervous system essentially, and when we don't feel safe, sometimes the body can produce signals of pain, to kind of signal danger in a psychological sense. I've had clients where, after a particularly emotional therapy session, they've experienced physical pain as their body kind of processes what they're going through. The two are so linked.
Yeah, it's amazing to me. It's amazing, and I think that there's other aspects to it that you could even look deeper into. It is the idea of your response to that pain, and how your conscious response to that pain can often drive bigger issues. And one example, I guess, is is the idea of like someone who has asthma when they're younger and then they lose it as they get older, where you look at oftentimes their response in cases is, I heard someone describe it before as asthma in a child is, now this is obviously like a insensitive way of saying it, but it was more like an inability to deal with the stressor at the time. And it was like, and I would love to get your opinion on this, where they have lost a little bit control of their breathing rate. And as a result, then things start to
Mm.
close up a small bit more. Now, there's more to that. I don't
Yeah,
mean to sound insensitive, but it's an interesting perspective.
but I think it opens the door perhaps, and this is a perspective that I've heard within the kind of the somatic psychology community that I'm part of, around asthma as a kind of respiratory trauma. Um, it's- which I think, yeah, is an interesting way of looking at that kind of experience. It's like the experience of having your lungs kind of having to work in the way they do have to work when you're doing intense exercise can be so overwhelming that it can be experienced as something traumatic. And so then that changes the way that we would then work with it, and sort of relearning to feel safe whilst exerting yourself. The solution starts to look a little different when you put that lens on it.
Yeah, it does, because it looks, if you kind of I think that's a really important one, is to reframe it in ways when possible. Obviously, you would need to be safe with these issues as well. But if there's a possibility that you can reframe an issue like this and then teach someone the skills, the tactics, and the strategies to overcome that themselves and give them back that independence, I think it's powerful. But it's a conversation that's difficult to have because of the fact that you it's someone it's a serious condition, you know.
Mm. Yeah, and it's seriously unpleasant, and no one wants to experience pain. It's a really normal thing to want to push pain away. Um, but kind of chronic avoidance of pain brings its own set of problems. Ironically enough, more pain a lot of the time. And I think, we talk about pain tolerance, we talk about all of this kind of stuff, but I think an acceptance of pain, perhaps on a more societal level, I don't see it. Right? Not that we shouldn't have to accept pain that doesn't need to be there, but when pain is here, right? Boatload of pain just showed up. Most people's instinctive responses will be to reach for the things that numb or kill that pain instantly. We have drugs that do this for us, and thank goodness, right? But at the same time, so I'm not advocating that people should feel all of their pain all of the time. That's that's not reasonable. But there's something about habituating ourselves to feeling intense things which can be helpful. If you look at all the mindfulness based approaches to chronic pain, you go into the pain, and very often that becomes the solution in a very helpful way of managing it, because once you're in the pain, um, I say this from personal experience, as well as from working with lots of different kinds of clients with these issues. It's never scary. It can be as awful as you think it is, but often that kind of daily, like that chronic pain that just grinds you down day by day by day. Actually going into that pain and feeling out the nuances, and actually how dynamic that pain is. You think you know where it is. Pay attention. You'll find out that the landscape is a lot more dynamic than you realize. And yeah, I think there's something to be said for learning to go into the pain when it's appropriate, rather than
Yeah.
always avoiding it, because then that's not helpful either.
Yeah, and we can see like the epidemic in the, like let's look at the States specifically, where the idea of avoiding pain all the time, how that has developed, and an overuse of painkillers has driven the opioid crisis. Yeah, has really caused a lot of problems out there because of that. Now, obviously, we can't stem that back to people avoiding pain, but it's a response to pain. It's a response that people are taking to it, is to dull it. And obviously there's a lot more even socioeconomic side to that as well. But I think that a lot of people that I work with, their beliefs and attitudes towards pain has been driven by things that have happened to them in the past, what they feel it is. Like back pain is such an interesting one, because if someone believes, like you've probably heard people say, I put my back out. Like if you put your back out, that's a pretty severe, that's catastrophic injury. That's a spinal cord injury. Uh, but even just the language and using that mental picture in your head, if you put your back out 6 weeks ago lifting a box, or if that's what you feel you did, you will do absolutely anything in your power to avoid putting your back out again, which leads itself to you having these fear avoidance behaviors where you stop your back, then deconditions, and your ability to tolerate any load on it at all decreases massively. So there is, I think, the image that you have in your head around the injury that you have is really important as well, because that can drive that response.
Yeah,
Does that make sense?
absolutely. Yeah, you get that. Absolutely. And that kind of narrowed behavioral repertoire um, that can come when we start to live life according to what we have to avoid rather than what we want to approach. We start seeing the behaviors that are available to us narrowing massively, which yeah feeds into the problem essentially.
Yeah, it does, and it builds. I often say to people, like, if you say to yourself, "I'll never run a 10K," if you give that about 3 years, it'll probably be, "I'll never run a 5K," and if you give that another couple of years, it'll probably be, "I won't run at all." We rarely check these limits and rarely push through them in many cases, until someone else gives us the opportunity to do it. I think, and a lot of cases, that's what I feel that from a physio perspective is people are just looking for that obviously the guidance and the accountability and everything, but just that reassurance that if you do lean into that, you will be okay if you do these things after it. So I think that's a huge one. And I think then when we look at I guess the psychotherapy side of it, what would be approaches that you would take for people in that situation who have set those limits in front of them, who have said that I can't do this, I won't be able to do that. How would you approach someone who's kind of got into
No
that
pressure.
bit of a trap?
Well, I think it's helpful to start to unpick these kind of beliefs because I think fundamentally we believe what we need to believe in order to keep ourselves safe in the way that we feel we need to be kept safe, right? The mind is organized for protection and survival, pretty much always. And so it's like these beliefs are keeping you safe from a perceived threat. So how we then work with that, how we then sort of um, figure out what's helpful, what's unhelpful, what's workable, what's not workable here. What would you like your life to look like? Is this path, and we can predict the way it's going to keep going, is this what you want your life to be? A yes, no? If it is yes, great, crack on, I will support you. If it's not, then okay, how can we create those changes? But yeah, coming back to this point of like your mind is trying to keep you safe, and so is your body. That pain, when we're talking about the kind of pain that doesn't actually have physiological damage attached to it, the 95%. This is your body trying to protect you from something. Your mind, body, mind, the whole system. It's about protection, and so we have to take that seriously because we can be really grateful that our body is trying to keep us safe. Thank you is often a great place to start. But then, is this workable? Is this helping me get to where I want to go in the long run? If not, what can we do differently?
Okay, so really, you need to acknowledge it first and acknowledge the fact that this is happening. There's nothing that we can do right now that's going to change everything, and that, as you said, like that thank you of, okay, I appreciate what you're trying to do, but I'm trying to do something else at the moment. You're kind of standing in my way a little bit. Having that conversation with the body. I was only talking to a client yesterday who was talking about a knee issue that she was dealing with, and she was like, the way she described it to me, she was like, if I jump on the left leg, everything's good, but when I jump on the right leg, I feel like we're having a conversation that if I keep going, this leg is going to break down, and I'm going to have to deal with that for the next 6 months. And I was like, well, could we have a little bit of a negotiation there, that you chat to it and say that, okay, well, we'll do it at 10%, for 10 seconds at 10%. Is there a possibility we can do that and negotiate a little bit with the
Mm.
body? Because, as you
Yes.
said, they're connected. The mind and body are connected.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's one of the I really like having mind body dialogues in sessions. In sessions or God, at the gym, when my left knee's going, we can't do this anymore. I'm going, because sometimes my body taps out before my mind does, or my mind decides that it's over, and my body's like, I've actually got more in the tank. And so sometimes we just have to have a little conversation, like, is this serious? Should I be listening to this, or are you actually just kind of tapping out when we've got way more in the tank? And sort of being able to have those dialogues can kind of help you feel your way through this process a little better, and get your mind and your body working together, because so often, particularly when we've been injured for a really long time, the mind can start to resent the body, and vice versa, and that relationship can really sour.
Yeah, that's such a good point. That's an excellent point on how the mind does resent the body. A lot of people that, especially that I work with, would say that the body, I feel like the body is fighting against me. I feel like it's working against me. It's working in the other way, even though I want to go one way. It does bring us down the path, and this is something that I know that it's actually there was a perfect piece I saw that I think you may have just posted it this morning on LinkedIn, on the scientific method, and how we might not, the scientific method may not be as effective for the social sciences, because it's going to be very difficult to objectively prove that the conscious mind is going to have a huge impact on the body objectively.
It's yeah, there's the scientific method, I think, is a great ideal. It's just it's harder in the social sciences to produce meaningful and quote unquote objective data. How do you, and objective data generally means numbers of some kind. It's like, how well adjusted is this person? How meaningful is their life? 7.
Yeah. Yeah.
I don't know if no one's going to be able to see my face, but it's not impressed, right? It's like my problem with psychology comes often back to, it's a kind of a philosophical issue, and I love my discipline. I'm a proud psychologist, all of this stuff, but I don't always think we know what we think we're studying. It's like you have different books will give you different definitions of what psychology is studying. Usually it's behavior. Some people acknowledge like human interiority on top of that. But it's like we're running around trying to measure things objectively so that we can be taken seriously, like the hard sciences. And in reality, how do you produce meaningful, objective data about someone's experience of what it is to be them, to be a human, to be a person who lives in a body that is chronically unwell or permanently injured? You know, I think we can run into problems. We can make interesting things and sort of more. I'm not saying that quantitative data is useless. It's not. It's very, very helpful in a lot of ways, but I think we can sometimes be over reliant on it and not ask those questions of like, okay, we've got all these great measurements and we think they're valid and all of that, but what is it that we think we're measuring here? What are we talking about? Like, what is the mind? When we use this word mind, we use this word consciousness. What are we talking about? There doesn't seem to be like a unified consensus or understanding or standpoint here. And I think actually, if we're going to study what it is to be human, we should probably have had that discussion of what it
Yeah.
is that we're studying.
Yeah. Is it even possible to, like, within that discussion, along that point, is it possible to pick out what it is to be human? Because it's never really the same in time. If you like
Mm,
being someone today, you're going to
yeah,
be a different person tomorrow based off of your interactions with
exactly.
your environment. So
It's
how do
that
you even go
inherent
about?
subjectivity.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. It's a very challenging topic. So how do you bridge the gap? Because you can't, as you said, to be accepted into the hard sciences, and for people to I guess agree with the opinions, or to even consider your opinions, you need to show results.
Mm. So I think there's a place for that kind of quantitative data, but I think what is necessary, in my perspective, in any case, is to kind of re-philosophize psychology, so that we're able to have the question not just about how we're studying and what we're finding out from our methods, but also the conversation of what we're studying here. Um, and yeah, being able to kind of appreciate, that okay, we can find some quote unquote, I keep using quotes around objective. One big philosophical question for me is whether objective data is a pipe dream or not. And the kind of the subjective nature. We need to bring philosophy back into the conversation. I think it will enrich things massively. To be fair, I think that of most disciplines, I think would be quite helpful to bring philosophy into the picture. I think so many academic programs tell us what to think, but they don't necessarily teach us how to think well. And that's something that I know that I have learned a lot from philosophy. How to think critically, how to build a good train of argumentation, to know the difference between reality and your model of reality. All these kinds of questions I think are really important, that we ask ourselves. I mean, most people who've done doctoral study do eventually, but yeah, I think it needs to start earlier.
Yeah, it's definitely an interesting subject. So let's dive into it a little bit. What, when you look at, I guess in psychology, that's obviously a huge one with the scientific method. Is there anything else? The mind body connection is another big one. Where
Mm.
do where do you see philosophy playing the biggest role in psychology?
In psychology, I think it's for me. I think it's a lot around the mind body connection. It's the mind body problem. It's
Yeah.
it's it's what is the. I think this is, and maybe this is because of my background in sport and exercise, that the body is so present and so important and relevant. But I think that mind body question is a really important one to be asking ourselves, because the philosophy is active and it's present and it's working whether you're aware of it or not, right? It's like we can see, you may never have heard of Cartesian dualism, this idea that the mind is purely mental and the body is purely physical, and we're not quite sure how they interact, but we're assuming in some way. And you see that, okay, that is enacted in most of our healthcare systems. For example, we do body stuff over here and we do mind stuff over there, right? And so that philosophy is alive and well and being enacted, but it's being enacted perhaps unconsciously. And so I think we need to return to this question of, actually, if the mind and the body are inseparably connected, which I suspect to be true, then what does that mean, actually? How might that change the way that we approach care of people with various primarily physical issues or primarily mental difficulties? We've got so much evidence about how anxiety and depression can be seriously helped just by engaging in exercise more or walking in nature more. And likewise, we know that a bunch of physical diseases have emotional roots. And so it's just like we know it's a whole mess, but we haven't really accounted for the kind of deeper philosophical framework that would be helpful to help us start addressing it.
Yeah, it's how does it, what you said there about, we know that certain emotional issues are connected to some diseases, or we have that idea or opinion. Like, how could you even ever go about measuring that? Like, is that I know you did emotional mapping before, in some of your research, but is that one way of looking at, like, over time, how that develops over time? Is it opinion over time? I know there was one, or sorry, go ahead. I'll leave that and then I'll
No,
go to the
no, no, no,
next.
please finish, please finish.
No,
I
I
think
was going to
that
say,
the
because it was,
first place.
you go,
There's a
you
little
go, you go,
lag.
you go.
Okay,
Yeah.
okay. So the first place that I was thinking about. So I do a lot of work with anger as well, and then we can see that anger is related to a whole host of physical issues, like cardiovascular problems, some neurological. So there is a clear link, and if I could remember who wrote the paper, I'd cite it now, but I can't remember off the top of my head. But there is research that links anger to physiological disease. So we know that there is a link between certain mental experiences and certain physical experiences. So yeah, that's kind of the first place. I can't remember what the second part of what you said was.
No, that's a good. I'd love to get on that trail with the anger, because that's a good point. Because obviously, the emotion of anger itself is going to draw certain physiological, I guess, changes, especially when you're looking at the fight or flight. Anyone that's in like who's angry all of the time or who's easily snaps, they're going to put themselves into this stress state, which as a result increases blood pressure, increases heart rate, and all of the side effects that come with chronically being stressed or being in that chronic state. So you can actually see how there would be a very clear correlation between one and the other there, between anger and
Yeah.
that.
Yeah. And I mean, yeah, I think that it's really interesting, and it raises the kind of question of like, well, okay, is the anger an emergent property of the physiological state, or does the anger create the physiological state, and does it really matter? Is another is the third part of that question. But um yeah, there's clearly a link, and so I would argue that that means that we need to act as if that is true, and yeah, we need to act as if that's true, that as if there is a link.
And how does that reform then the health services? Knowing that if you can start to prove a link, if you can start to see the change, how do you then go about changing that within your health service?
God, $1 million question. I'm not sure
Billion.
how we would change things on a kind of a massive structural organizational level. It may have to start just by funding the mental health service more. Stop cutting funding to it. You know, it's pretty important. That way, people who get a major diagnosis, maybe it should be normal that you then immediately get access to therapeutic services, and that both therapists and body workers, to kind of just put them in two big categories, are sufficiently trained about what the other half is doing. You don't, as if you're a physio, you don't need to be a psychologist, but you need to understand what might be happening in that room. And likewise, as a psychologist, you don't need to be a physio, but it can be really helpful to have a basic understanding of the body and how it functions and how it might support the problem that the individual is dealing with. So I think there needs to be a lot more interdisciplinarity.
Yeah, absolutely. There's a multidisciplinary approach needed. It's the crossover. I think it's nearly like you could, if you just I'm just hypothesizing now, throwing out ideas. If you did make like a group based session where you had your psychologist and you had your physios, and you had maybe someone who was able to try connect the two, that's a bit more. I would even throw out that having some form of a spiritual leader there is in, well, whether that be a specific religious figure or someone who works within the community or whatever, who's able to try and make that connection a small bit better, because it's very difficult to make the connection at the individual level and say, especially like, this is your problem, this is what you need to fix. But if you were able to throw ideas within a group, I think that sometimes that might be a bit more accessible to people, where they can connect to something and then take that away with them.
Group work is incredibly powerful. I think Bessel van der Kolk, who wrote The Body Keeps a Score, he speaks about group work as being the most effective for resolving. He's talking about trauma in that sense, but I think there is, we're social animals. It makes a lot of sense why group work would be incredibly helpful for us. And yeah, acknowledging the spiritual element that many people feel is important in their lives can sort of, yeah, bring another lens, that holistic approach essentially.
Yeah, it's very. I guess it's definitely a topic that needs to be discussed more. But will it be
Mm.
implemented at an institutional level anytime soon? I
Not holding my breath.
Yeah. Exactly. Yeah. Exactly. It's very. It's a discussion though that for me, I think it's been top of mind the last couple of years, is the idea of the mind body. I know we've touched on it now a little bit, but in our conversation on during the week, you discuss the history of the mind body and the history
Mm.
of how we went from, let's say, and now this is me throwing in my own or paraphrasing, the idea that before there was a connection there, that there was a mind body, everyone kind of knew that there was that they were connected, and then over time they started to split.
I think, I mean, there are a lot of people who make arguments that kind of in more indigenous traditions there is a more unified vision of the mind body, and I think that's a very fair argument to make. I think in the West, um, we've got the inheritance of a millennia and a half of Christianity, kind of, and that is undeniably mind body split massive, because you've got the soul or the spirit, which is God given and it's immaterial and it lasts beyond your death, so it can't be physical, right? Because all matter dies, and then that the body is a lump of meat that you drag around for as much of your life as you can. Um, and so we have that massive inheritance. I don't think we can overlook that culturally. And then at the same time, you've got a science that has also kind of fallen into that mind body split. The body is real, quote unquote, and we can study it, we can get objective data on it, so it's much more, we can get interesting stuff out of it. But the mind, it's just this ephemeral subjective thing that we can't really necessarily gain any objective access to, so it becomes less interesting in a sense. And so that split has been perpetuated, and it's not universal. You've got lots and lots of schools within psychology, the psychodynamic tradition particularly, and then like more humanistic and existentialist approaches which really go into it. But a lot of the more dominant paradigms within psychology, like the cognitive behavioral bunch, it's less it's not an interesting question about what is the mind, what is its structure, what is it like, all of that stuff. um yeah, I'm off on a tangent. I can't remember where I was going.
No, it's perfect because
Okay.
I've so many different ways I want to go about that. But you said there that the idea of Christianity and the spirit and the body and how we're just kind of carrying around this body for the time that we're here on Earth. I think that's a really uh, it's an interesting way of looking at it. In ways you can see how even the scientific method then would have driven that more because of the objectivity of it, of looking at, okay, well, that's something physical, we can measure that. You were able to, let's just say, look at a sports specific example. You were able to broad jump 4 feet before that injury, or 5 feet before the injury, and now you're able to broad jump only 3 feet after the injury. So there's a very clear, very clear disconnect between what the injury has and how that has related to your physical attributes. But then the yeah, yeah, it's how I can see. Yeah, it's a. My God, there's lots of different ways you can go with that. How what how did it go so far apart though? Like, is it just in the last couple 100 years? I know. Um, what was the name of the guy that you mentioned there? Descartes. How the, there's a big issue in physiotherapy with his opinion on pain, and you've probably seen the picture of the boy who touches the fire. And it's like a boy or man sitting beside a fire. His hand or his foot touches off it, and then it shows a very direct correlation of foot touching the fire going to brain, and they're basically making this thing that all pain has a physical
Yeah.
stimulus, and
Yeah.
that has been
If
driven.
only.
Yeah, all that has been driven through, and so it makes it so much more difficult then to try to explain to people, because that's just at the foundational level. That's where people's knowledge of pain comes from.
Yeah,
It's
that's
difficult to
super
change that.
interesting because, wait, yeah, very, very. That's really interesting, and the parallel jumps into my mind of, like, for example, depression. Kind of earlier views of depression were that there was something in the environment that would have caused it. It was the assumption that something has happened. Much more modern versions show that depression can sometimes be, I guess you'd call it, acausal, or not caused by an external stimulus. But yeah, it's just like what we view as real, um, is really highlighted in kind of those examples. It's the pain is real if you touch the fire. If you didn't touch the fire, it's just all in your head. Stop thinking it, you know,
Yeah,
and other
yeah.
ridiculous statements.
That's it. That's why it can be so difficult to have that conversation with someone in my position, where I'm saying to them, look, I know the back pain is there. I know you're getting the flare ups. I know all of that is happening. But there's an element here that it's our response that could be contributing to that pain. And then the first question is, So you're saying it's all in my head. It's like, no, I'm not saying that. If only it was, I'd just tell you to say this thing over and over again and you're going to forget about it. But I wish it was that easy. There is that element of it that old habits die hard, for absolute sure, I think. But when we're looking at the history then of where it has been, where it's come from in the past, knowing what we know now or understanding what we know now, where do you see it going in future?
I think I think we're going to see a growing recognition that the mind and the body are not so easily separated. And the reason I think this is primarily from the kind of the trauma world and this new paradigm that's kind of sort of growing in popularity. The trauma paradigm forces us to treat the mind and body as inseparable. And I think that lens is gonna continue to grow, and I think some interesting things will happen with that, because I mean the trauma lens isn't just about trauma either. I mean, being trauma informed, I have found, makes you better at helping people with their performance. It's two sides of the same coin. You know, if you can work with trauma, you can work with performance. It's just you're stretching the person in a slightly different way. Um, so yeah, I think this wave, this zeitgeist in public consciousness, I think might change things slightly. Um, I hope anyway.
Okay. Yeah, hopefully that's the goal. Uh, as we go down then the path of integrating the mind and body more, there's going to be an element of someone's background, their values, their beliefs. There's going to be no prescription that will work for everybody. I think we understand that. I think everyone has an idea that that's the case. So how do we get a better understanding of what will work for one person versus what won't work for another person? Is it the philosophies
Mm,
that they've had in the past, their beliefs? Is it what they hold going
who
forward?
knows? You know, like what it's there's so many different things. I think we can't throw out all of our quantitative. We can understand broadly about trends, right? I don't think we have universal laws when it comes to human beings, but we can talk to broad tendencies, right? So it's like if we bring it back to the nervous system, and we can say that when someone is in a state of hyperactivation, that sympathetic nervous system is fully online. We can broadly say these kinds of things tend to be helpful to downregulate. But you know, breath, touch, grounding, orienting, all these kinds of things. um, but you will get someone who's had respiratory trauma, and for whom slow breathing makes everything worse. Conscious breathing, terrible idea. There'll be someone for whom touch, self-touch or touch from other people, that absolutely not. That sets off all of the alarm systems. And so I think it's just an understanding, okay, these things tend to be helpful, but as I say to my clients, it's like these are just general suggestions. Some of them might work for you, none of them might work for you. That's okay. You know, we're here to figure out solutions for you. And there's always a solution. You might need to be creative from time to time, but I think that's your job. So,
Yeah.
you know.
So you think about it all the time, so you should be able to come up with some solution for it.
One would hope. Yeah.
It's a just you after something just sparked in my mind when you said that there about the physical touch. But what's your thoughts on love languages?
Oh, curveball. I love it. I think they're nice general tendencies. I think the model itself doesn't have a huge amount of validity. Um, I think it was this American guy. What's his name? I can't remember his name. Whose model this is? He was a pastor, a priest, some kind of Christian religious leader. Um, and so I think he may have had a slightly narrow, how am I going to say this, narrower demographic group. So they're all going to be, I think, believe they were all kind of heterosexual couples from a certain background. And so whilst these are nice broad tendencies, and they kind of have a lot of face validity, right? You can read through them and you go, yeah, all right, I see myself in some of these things. They're great. So I think they're good as a kind of a framework for reflection, but they shouldn't necessarily be treated as a map of like, these are the love languages. And there are no others.
Yeah, because just as you said that with the physical touch, it kind of brings the idea to me that with, I know you train yourself. I know you've trained in the past, especially in combat sports. It's something that, as I step back from and I'm removed from it, like let's say if I picked up an injury in my knee last year, and I was out of jiu-jitsu for a while, and I wasn't that element of I was going to say violence, but it's not violence. The element of combat, the element of combat, I think was I missed that. Really did miss that, and I felt that I held it in a lot more because I wasn't able to go and hit a bag or do boxing and hit pads or jump in with somebody and do a bit of rolling. I don't know, is it the competition, but even if I just go skipping or if I hit a bag or if I go shadowboxing, I can get a lot of the same kind of release from it. But I was wondering there, as you were talking about it, was it the physical touch that I was missing out on from that performance, that competitive aspect, as well as combined with the physical touch element of it?
Yeah, I think we can miss physical touch, and it's a very different, obviously a very different kind of physical touch than perhaps the
Yeah,
love
yeah.
languages are
That's what I mean, the
referring
violence.
to. It's consensual, so it's fine. But yeah, there is something about that. It's like, when I think about times where I've been shadowboxing or even like hitting the bag, hitting the bag is fine. Um, but there's a very different feeling to when you're sparring and the thing that you're making impact with is flesh and bone, and that it has a different feedback, it has a different feel. I mean, I think Brazilian jiu-jitsu for me is a particularly interesting one because obviously there's no striking, and it's your body is constantly in contact with someone else's body essentially on some level. And I mean, it doesn't, if you're, I used to drill with the dummy, and things like that. And technically, there's touch in that horror. I don't know what it was made of, but it was always a bit gross, slightly slippery. But
Sweaty,
maybe
yeah.
that was the humidity of the room. Yes. Oh God. We used to train in a basement as well. Anyway, won't go down that road. But yeah, there's something about the touch there, and it's funny. Sometimes that touch can be reassuring, even within a combat situation. Um, and sometimes that touch can feel dangerous. I don't know if you've ever had that moment where it's just flipped and you've gone, okay, we're not safe here. And so I don't know, maybe this is just me as a female at a jiu-jitsu gym. There have been moments where I remember one time a guy picked me up and threw me headfirst at a wall.
Oh, gee, okay, yeah.
He never
Okay,
came
no,
back.
I've been lucky. He never came back, hopefully. Hopefully he was dealt with it today.
I hope that never happens to you. But,
Yeah.
in
But I know
that
what you mean when
moment,
there's a switch. There's a
Mm,
switch, yeah,
your
where it
experience
gets
of touch
aggressive.
really changes. And so I think for a lot of people who've had experiences of touch where the touch is aggressive, because that's the thing about Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, people assume it's aggressive. It's actually not when you're in a training situation and it's, you've got decent people on the mat. But for people who've had a lot of aggressive touch or a non-safe touch in their lives, the touch that would sometimes reassure or soothe many other people will absolutely not have that impact on them whatsoever. Yeah.
Yeah, that's a good point. Because you do notice that switch. At the start there, when you said it, I was like, I don't know if I have. But then as you say it, as you talk about it more, that switch of like, it's so clear in boxing. It's so clear. When you hit somebody, like when you're sparring, you're tapping away, and then you hit someone that's a little bit harder than you should have.
Mm-hmm.
And then, like, oh, that's coming back. Like, that's going to, I'm going
Yeah.
to pay for that. It's
Yes.
it's the change is and there's an environmental change, like there's a, like around you can feel it in the air, the whole thing changes,
Yes.
which I guess
Yeah.
depending on your familiarity with it in the past, you can see how social situations can escalate because people haven't been in that situation before, and when
Mm-hmm.
the environment changes, they don't know how to react and they change with it and they continue to escalate.
Yes. Yes. It's like their nervous system will continue to upregulate. It's like it's up. We need it's high alert. We need to go into fight or flight. This is a serious situation. And then just you see it in their eyes. It's like it's a visceral feeling. You know when that switch is flipped. You just feel it in your body. It's aware that it's no longer a friendly situation, and we need to access more of our sympathetic nervous system in order to make this as safe as possible. But then, depending on who you are, your size, your sex, your gender, all of these things. Where the way you're going to be perceiving the threat is going to be different. Yeah.
Yeah, and how are you able to downregulate then after that, or in that situation when you remove yourself? Are you able to kind of calm down? I know in Robert Sapolsky's book, or Dr. Robert Sapolsky's book, Why Zebras Don't Get Ulcers, it's like the perfect title for a book on stress. It couldn't be. Have you?
Yes.
I don't know. Have you come across it?
It's actually on my gigantic pile of books on the bedside table that I need to get through.
It's excellent. In essence, zebras don't get ulcers because zebras don't become chronically stressed. You only get an ulcer when you're chronically stressed.
Okay.
The zebra stressor is very in front of him. It's like, read the book that he goes into so much detail about how to manage stress, how to look at it in different ways. It's excellent. I really, really enjoyed it. He even goes into the aspect of how spirituality is a way of managing stress. Understanding that there's something out there that's helping you can help you to regulate or downregulate your nervous system in a lot of ways as well. So a powerful book, I think, and he's a great guy to listen to on lectures. He's funny. Like, he couldn't care less.
I've watched a couple of his lectures, and he's a good speaker. And that idea, it makes me think of, I don't know if you've run into Peter Levine. He's part of he's a relatively big name in the trauma world. His modality is somatic experiencing. He wrote a book called Waking the Tiger, which is an excellent title. And he makes a similar argument. It's like wild animals don't get traumatized.
Yeah, okay. Why? That's my book. I'm going to buy that now after this.
I mean, God, it's been ages. How am I going to do this argument justice? He talks a lot about... So, for example, I think that one of the examples that I think are helpful is like, if you ever watched a nature documentary and a lion captures a gazelle, drags it back to its den, doesn't kill it in this situation, and then you keep watching, the lion leaves to go hunt for more stuff, and you see the gazelle having like a full body tremor, and then off it goes, it's fine. Similarly, I don't know, I have a cat, so I watch her torture small rodents occasionally, and not for fun.
Sounds like a Friday night.
Just occasionally, yeah. Sometimes it is, yeah. So she'll catch a mouse, and the mouse will go really still. It'll go into freeze, right? And we know that when someone goes into freeze, that's usually a precondition for a traumatization. It means you've been overwhelmed to the point where you cannot cope, and your body has shut you down, right? Like what's that film with Leonardo DiCaprio with a bear in the woods?
Revenant.
That's it. Yeah. So you've got that's kind of like a trauma response. And so the mouse goes into freeze. It's adorable, and I do try and save as many as I can. And eventually it'll have like a full body shake, and then I'll sort of distract the cat and usher it back into the garden. And so Peter Levine talks about how actually, because wild animals have this ability to essentially discharge that trauma energy, essentially, and then return to a baseline. But what he says is the only animals that aren't able to do this are human beings and zoo animals. I think we have to probably go into things around the environment and the kind of the chronic traumatization of caged wild animals. And then I think we probably have to look at things like memory and start going down the neuroscience angle. But he does a much better job of explaining this than I do.
That's fair. Yeah, that's fair. I know it's everything, to be honest, All right, I really appreciate you jumping on. Everything that you covered is huge there. I think it's going to be very helpful for a lot of people. One thing I want you just to touch on just before we jump off, for a minute or two, if you have it, is the idea of somatic psychology, of what people can learn from that. Because I know you've mentioned it a couple of different times, and I just don't want to leave before we touch on it.
Okay. So somatic psychology is a branch of psychology that treats the mind-body connection really, really seriously. So it's basically gone, the mind and the body are not separable. Okay, so now what do we do? Like, as psychologists, how do we act? Now that we've gone, well, we can't separate the two, so we kind of have to work with the two together. What are we going to do? And so there are many different like modalities that fall within this somatic psychology bracket. You've got somatic experiencing from Peter Levine. You've got sensory motor psychotherapy from Pat Ogden. You've got Eugene Gendlin's focusing. There are lots and lots of different, Focusing by Eugene Gendlin is an excellent book to read. But these are basically different approaches, different methodologies for integrating somatic experience. So what it is like to have a body, right? The body does not communicate with language. That's a mind thing. The body communicates through sensation, essentially. So if you're working using somatic psychology, you're integrating sensation and movement into your sessions, essentially. So awareness of body, working with feelings, essentially, because it's like, what do you mean when you say you're angry? Angry is not it's not a purely cognitive experience. If you take away the racing heart, the heat, the kind of the need to clench your fist, the tension in your jaw, if you take that away from your experience of anger, you're not angry anymore. It's inseparable. And so if you were a somatic psychologist and you had an angry person in front of you, you'd be working with the body, right? Anger is a doing emotion. It's sympathetically charged. We have to do things when we're in that place. So what can we do? How can we move to facilitate the movement of this feeling, this sensation, really visceral sensation through your body and, ultimately out. It's a different way of doing things. So if I'm working with an angry person, I've done push-ups with angry people before. Pushing motions are really good when we're angry. All different kinds of things. If you're working with someone who's feeling really disempowered and their confidence is through the floor, you might work on that floppy feeling that the body feels like. And I might do weightlifting with them to really get them in touch with that feeling of strength in their bodies. And so, yeah, you're bringing the body into the conversation and not just talking about thoughts in a kind of only above the neck kind of conversation. You're trying to involve the whole being in it.
Okay. So that's very interesting. You're really, obviously you're connecting the two, but in a way you're getting them to live through the emotion that they're feeling, isn't what you could say. Yeah. Okay. Yeah, I'm gonna have to look into that book, Focusing, Eugene Epman, is that you said?
Gendlin, Gendlin.
Lin. Okay.
I'm never actually sure how to pronounce it. I've just kind of...
That's another one of those words that I can't pronounce. So I left out the University of Hertfordshire at the start because I'm going to just make a balls of it.
You nailed it, so it's fine.
So first off, I want to thank you so much, Aura, for jumping on. It was an excellent podcast. I think a lot of people can take away. There was a lot of, avenues that we went down that probably aren't spoken about enough when it comes to the mind-body connection and the idea of philosophy. I could stay on here for another 2 hours talking about it, but I'm conscious of time, so I want to be sure that I want to thank you for everything that you've said today. Thank you for jumping on, and maybe in future we might get you on and talk through things again.
I would love that. It's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you for a very interesting conversation.
Lovely stuff, and thank you to everybody for listening, and we will chat to you all again at the same time next week. Have a good one.